So this is a reminder of our purpose of these discussions. They are here. We are having them for you, for lead agencies, to really have that opportunity to talk with each other about how you're approaching your cost analysis, the challenges you're having. And this topic specifically is talking about funding. We have heard funding can be a challenge. So thinking beyond the analysis, how to use some of your data to document the need for funding and explore funding sources. So our agenda will be, we're going to do some introductions in just a minute. Or brainstorm questions that you might have for our discussion. Then Bruno's going to share some ideas, thoughts that he has, and then we'll jump right into our discussion. So introductions. If you can, in the chat, share your name, your state and territory, and your role. And if you would like, if you want to join in our fun question, I'm always looking for really cool places to travel to. So I'd love to hear your recommendations on places to travel to. And I will start. My name's Heather Madison again. I live in Vermont and I work for the National Center on Subsidy, Innovation, and Accountability. I am a subject matter expert on cost and price data in childcare. And where I want to travel to most is Italy. I haven't actually been yet, and all I keep hearing is wonderful things. So that's where I want to go most. I will say, for a recommendation, I just came back from Milwaukee and it was incredibly fun. I was not anticipating how fun it was, and it was incredibly fun. So I definitely recommend Milwaukee as a destination. So you can jump into the chat and share of New Zealand. I've heard New Zealand is beautiful. Ooh, the Black Hills, I've also heard those are really awesome to visit. So there's so many places I need to go. Ooh, Thailand, Cambodia, Japan, Scotland. Oh, Yellowstone, yes. Belize. I have been to Belize. It's really cool. Bora Bora, I would also love to go to Bora Bora. So I'd love to keep seeing the messages. So we're going to jump right in to our discussion. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to do this awkward stop sharing to start sharing again thing. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to move to the Mural board discussion where we brainstorm the questions that you might have. And I'm going to put into the chat a link to the Mural board. And then I will be sharing my screen with the Mural board and give you some instructions. So all right, I know this is really small to get the entire Mural board in there, but what we do if this is your first session or you haven't been in a little while is we spend a little bit of time brainstorming questions that we want to think about for our discussion. And this one is around funding and using data for funding. There are some questions already in there as prompts. But feel free to just go ahead and jump in and add all the questions. So there's 3 sections, one on funding sources, one on the data to support funding, and then we have an other section. So all questions are welcome. We may not hit everyone. To use Mural, there are some sticky notes currently available, and you can just go ahead and click on a sticky note and you can start typing. You can also add a sticky note over on your left if you're in a laptop, which you can just pick a color. It's going to add it randomly. You can just move it around to wherever you want it to be. You can make it bigger or smaller as you need it. You can also react to the sticky notes. So you can, if you hover over one, you'll see very teeny tiny add a reaction. You also have an add a reaction at the bottom. We will use those reactions to kind of as a voting option for questions that are a priority. So if you see a question that somebody's already typed in that you also have, feel free to jump in and just react to that question. And we'll look at those and try to pull as many of those into our conversation as possible. You can also respond to a question. You can go ahead and hit text. So you'll hit the one that you want to respond to. You can hit comment. I'm gonna kind of put it somewhere. And it's gonna create this little pin that you can put over that, and you can enter your comment over it in the right. Once you've entered that, you can also, if somebody else has entered a comment and you want to reply to it, you just click on the pin and you can reply to that comment. So if you have some ideas of maybe some creative solutions that you've tried for funding, and you want to give some of those ideas, you know, give us some great ideas or tell us what didn't work, you can go ahead and actually reply right by adding one of those pins. And you can make it bigger or smaller on the right hand bottom where you can zoom in and zoom out. And that is, that won't affect the board for everybody. So you can go ahead and do that. If you do accidentally pick up the board and move it, that we'll all see that otherwise, but zooming in and zooming out using the zoom feature will only impact what you see. It will not impact what the rest of us see. And Nina, Carol, anything I missed?
No, thorough explanation.
We've done it enough. I'm feeling like I think I tried to hit most of the points. So we're going to take a few minutes for you to be able to think about your questions, responses, reactions. And I will stop talking to give you some time. It's great. We're getting some good questions in the mural. This is really helpful around thinking about your messaging of costs and funding for costs. And how to really translate that information. Some ideas on some dashboards that some people use to give some data on the usage of subsidy. All right, so I think I'm not going to cut anybody off from responding to the mural, but I am going to stop sharing my screen. You will continue to have access to the mural. Feel free to continue to add ideas, questions, thoughts there. You can also add questions in the chat feature, and we will be checking that as well so that we'll make sure we'll try to capture your questions. You also have the ability to raise your hands, come off mute and ask your question. There's nothing restricting you from doing that. So feel free if you have a question to jump right in and ask your question. And I'm going to now turn it over to Bruno to introduce himself. And I think he has some slides and information to share before we jump into our discussion. Bruno?
Yeah, appreciate that, Heather, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Let me see if I can successfully pull this up. Okay, hopefully everyone's seeing the beginning of that slideshow. So as Heather mentioned, my name is Bruno Showers. I'm State Policy Manager at Children's Funding Project. We're a C3 organization, obviously, where we envision that every child and youth in the country has the public funding that they need to thrive. And our theory of change on this is that we try to connect folks like you programs to equitable public financing strategies. And so I'll just kind of walk through what that means to us and how we think that kind of helps the field here. And in terms of specifically, as today's presentation is about, is finding creative funding opportunities. Okay, so to begin this conversation, you usually need to know what you're working with before you can advocate for more. And so the first thing that we do is we go in and assist states and localities with creating something that we call a fiscal map, which is a comprehensive view of this essentially, which typically these are the major funding sources in order for children's programs broadly construed. Usually it's federal funding streams, state funding streams, local funding streams, and then the smallest portion is like private philanthropic dollars. This is something that we found pretty consistently across the states, which makes sense if you just think about the fiscal capacity kind of gets smaller the lower down that you go. And so as I said, this is something that we can assist you with. I know some states, some of you may already have this information. So once you have, the current sources of funding, then the next question becomes, where's the rest of it going to come from? After you know how much you're currently spending, we can also help you with assisting and finding out how much you want to do, how much more you need to spend to meet your goals. Although again, I imagine that many of you already kind of have an ask in mind in some of these cases. So once you know how much you're spending and then you know how much more you want to raise, these are kind of the different areas that you can explore to raise additional public revenue, which is what we really need, because as the previous slide kind of indicated, the public sector is really where most of the financial capacity to fund these things it lies, essentially. And so especially at the state level, these are kind of the different things that we look at as potentially viable options. So you can either increase an existing tax or close a loophole, kind of increasing a tax by a different name, although it might be more palatable politically in some of your states and localities. You can create a new tax, which again, depending on the structure of that tax, may be more or less viable politically in some of your areas. And then capturing new revenue as it comes online is just trying to be opportunistic. And so I think the obvious recent example is that many states have begun to legalize recreational marijuana, and in several states, child advocates have tapped into that as it's become legalized, and we've put taxes on it. Some child advocacy communities have successfully lobbied to get that, go into their programs. And so I'll just walk you through some of the states that did this, that we've worked with in the last few years to do these things. So Colorado had a ballot initiative a few years back where they did a couple of these things at once. They increased an existing tax, and that it was a tobacco or sin tax, which is often more palatable even in like communities that aren't as open to increased tax rates, policymakers that aren't open to increasing income taxes, for instance. You can sometimes still convince them to raise sin taxes. And so Colorado raised what they were levying on tobacco products, but then also brought e-vaping cigarette, or e-cigarette vaping products up to parity with their tobacco products, raised revenue that way. Other examples here, just South Carolina, I think, is an interesting one. It's a very long time ago now, but they dedicate 1% of sales tax goes right to children's programs, a lot to ECE in particular. And then I've listed other examples here of other states that have done this recently. You can kind of see that closing loopholes to expand sales taxes to cover more services is another common one. Ending exemptions and deductions in the income tax code's been easier to do than raising rates, because you can still say that you're competitive at your top rate, but raise more revenue from people who can afford to pay it. And then just restructuring income tax brackets overall, obviously. So, for example, Massachusetts recently implemented a millionaire's tax, so adding essentially what was a new bracket onto their income tax system. All examples of ways that you can increase revenue in your state. And then new taxes, obviously, this will be very specific to where you are. But these are some of the examples that we like to share because they were kind of creative and ambitious. And so Washington State is the only state in the country that doesn't have an income tax, but does levy taxes on capital gains income. That recently successfully survived a court challenge. It raised way more revenue in its first year than was anticipated. Now, to be fair, there is a potential like ballot measure to try and repeal this tax. So we're hoping that they can defend that successfully. We're keeping a close eye on that. But this is just an example of something that recently raised a lot of revenue for children's programs, even more than anticipated. And then another example that we like, I really should have swapped the example, but Vermont last year, they were the first state to implement a payroll tax that funds child care subsidies in particular. So a lot of states now are using payroll taxes for what we typically call social insurance programs, so like paid family and medical leave. But Vermont's the first state to use it to subsidize child care, and at CFP we really think that's a model worth exploring in other states. Let me put it that way. And then capturing new revenue as it came online. This is just essentially the example that I gave you of, medical or recreational marijuana becoming legalized. So in Alaska, for instance, they've funded positive youth development out of school time programs using some share of their marijuana excise tax revenue. And then another kind of current meaningful, politically relevant one would be like online sports gambling. A lot of states have started to tap that, or as that's become more legal across more states, a lot of states are tapping that for education, childcare purposes. This is just kind of going a little bit deeper into a state that successfully did that. Personally, so just full disclosure, I'm sitting in Arkansas. My background is doing lobbying work in the Arkansas state legislature, and so I like to give examples from like red states, conservative states, where just to show that it's possible. I think there's sometimes a perception that this work. Every state has its own challenges. I don't want to just wanted to say that we like Louisiana because it's a state that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate would do a lot in this area, but I think given what they have to work with, they've done a really good job. And so basically, and it also gives a good example of how long this can take, I guess, too, because they initially created this fund in 2017 without any dedicated funding at all. And then it took subsequent local action essentially to spur the state, like shame the state into doing action. Haven't included here, but in 2017, 2018, New Orleans did their own local children's fund, and the state level fund was structured as a matching fund essentially. And so it was initially created without any revenue, but then when localities started to take the state up on the offer, policymakers kind of scrambled. It's like, okay, where's this going to come from? And then luckily, advocates have been working with the business community, with state legislators, especially key members on key committees. And so when these new sources of revenue came online, they were already ready with, the need, the impact, the economic impact. So they had the arguments that they knew would be useful for the legislature that they were working with. And by employing those, they successfully got, you can see here that most of the sources of revenue aren't really raising much, and it really is sports betting. But I still like that because our approach, our belief is that it's kind of like you need an all hands on deck here, like local action, state action, federal action, as many sources as you can cobble together because the need is so great. And also wanted to show like the way that this can get done even in a state like Louisiana is that it's fairly popular. I mean, this is not like will not always be true at every point in time, but generally speaking, childcare is popular enough that there's very few revenue raisers that, at least on a polling basis, don't poll well. People basically think that kids need to be taken care of and that we should be spending more on kids. And so oftentimes, in our work, we kind of are I feel like the program is almost like helps the campaign get across the finish line, because it is true that generally, if you don't have a specific use of your tax, that doesn't poll as well. But when people know that it's going to go to a specific purpose, and the purpose is something like childcare, that usually polls fairly well. And again, this isn't a conservative state like Louisiana. And again, just more of an example that shows that even, going into the general fund, that's, people are more skeptical of that even than if it's dedicated to a specific purpose. And this is just kind of some of the questions that we ask, or some of the things that we think our state partners and state advocates should be thinking about as they're trying to approach these revenue raising conversations. So, looking at the last slides, what are the potential revenue raisers in your state? What's legally possible? What's politically feasible? What's adequate to the need that you've decided you need in your state also is another important question to ask there. Building partnerships. I mentioned in Louisiana, they were aligned with the business community and that they worked with their state legislators. In other states, those will probably be meaningful, but there may be other interests. So if there's like a revenue coalition that's already existing, as there is in many states, making sure that early child care providers, advocates are talking to those folks that may be advocating on broad issues like healthcare or housing and trying to get revenue for those programs. Just making sure that the ECE childcare folks are involved in those conversations can be super important. The data on public opinion, if you're going to do a campaign, you definitely need to do polling to know if it's even feasible, if the voters will approve. And then most of the rest of this, I think, it's kind of flows from that, in the sense of, once you have the data, once you know the need, you need to be able to demonstrate it, usually narratively through stories, having the right spokespeople, which again, going to be dependent on state and local context. In some states, it might be a business leader. In other states, maybe it's more grassroots. It's parents, it's PTA. It just depends on the context. And then most importantly, I think, is if there's not an existing advocacy infrastructure around this issue, maybe you don't have, maybe not appropriate for this group, but for many of our advocates, even if you can't do a C4, don't have the capacity to do a C4, just ensuring that there's like staff time dedicated to advocacy and maintaining this kind of coalition, partnership, advocacy infrastructure is also a key ingredient in the success of these campaigns. And that really is related to how long they can take. It's very hard to keep your eye on the ball from 2017 to 2023 if there's not someone who's dedicated to making sure that that's maintained. And so these are some of the questions, some of the lessons that we've learned as we've begun to, assist states on these issues. And I'm seeing a couple of questions. I'm happy to take them. Just come off mute and let me know what you're thinking.
Bruno, I just had a clarifying question. This is Nina. Can you explain what a state level C4 is for people who aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, so C4 is like able to engage on campaigning issues in a more comprehensive way than C3s are. So C3s can dedicate some of their money to advocacy, public advocacy, but C4s have a much more leeway in how they engage on that. They're able to actually not do candidate work, but they can do like much more ballot initiative work, for instance, or endorse policies, put money towards getting out the vote in ways that C3s can't. So basically, it just allows you to use more of your revenue to engage on these policy campaigns. I guess the easiest way I can think of to explain it.
That makes sense. There's a comment that you may have seen from Debbie, just saying that tapping into sports betting and marijuana taxes are really forward thinking.
And the only thing I would say about that is, you're going to have to be proactive about it, because certainly other industries, other interest groups also have their eyes on this. So I don't want to give the perception that it's necessarily going to be a given that you guys are going to win that. But certainly, if you can, ideally have the conversations before it goes online and before the revenue starts being collected, So yeah, definitely want to be proactive as soon as you can on those kind of issues.
Bruno, I have one other question about partners and advocates. As you know, the audience for this call is CCDF lead agency staff primarily. And so I think in every state, they have a different relationship with advocates. And those of you on the call can speak to that better than I can. Do you have any thoughts or considerations about the engagement between government staff and advocates?
I wish I had a good answer to that, but so much of my work has been focused on the advocate side. I would
Yeah.
actually love to learn more from you all what that relationship is like, and what should I be telling advocates would be useful for them to say to you, or conversations to have with you all.
Great question.
That's a great question. Love to hear ideas, especially any limitations that somebody might have been given, or can't think of the right word, but a workaround to limitations as well. And will we see what ideas people have? I also had a question. Coming from Vermont, I am familiar with the payroll tax that went into effect in July. And it is specific in legislation what those funds can be used for. They are for a subsidy. And I'm curious for Louisiana, for their fund. It, I am sure, is identified as early childhood fund, but is it identified what activities that fund would pay for, or is it really wide open as long as it's early childhood?
No, it's very narrow, and I apologize so my background is in tax and budget issues, so I'm not an expert on ECE per se. I want to say it goes to CCAP assistance for particular FPL 0 to 3 maybe, but there are very specific uses of the funds. I'm just not quite sure off the top of my head exactly what they are.
Totally okay. Yeah, I mean, just you answered the question, which is it specific? And I guess my follow-up would then be, have you seen, and maybe you don't know, but that having a specific purpose beyond just early childhood or childcare is very helpful, right? So naming that it must go to childcare subsidy, eligibility or rates, or quality incentives. Or is it better to be a little more flexible when designing? And I know not everybody has control, right? You have legislatures and all those people that have great ideas as well. But I'm just thinking with what you can suggest. Is it better for it to be very specific, or is it better to be specific but also flexible?
So yeah, I think that's actually a really good question, and I think there's a tension there. So politically, it's usually better the hyper specific, the more specific you can get, like especially if you're taking it to the voters by ballot initiative. Often that makes it easier when it's like a very specific use. Not that they'll necessarily understand what a seat, like the policy issue, but the fact that it's very narrowly construed often does lead to more political support. But then I think this group probably understands that oftentimes policymakers aren't deep, and especially voters aren't deep enough in the weeds to know exactly what the needs of your programs are. And so I do personally see a lot of upside to giving more flexibility in these funds, but it's just I think it's a political tension between ensuring that they're used and making sure that there's like the popular support, and then that it's actually useful for programs and participants.
That makes sense. Thanks. And I was going to pause and see if there are any other questions before I just hit you with all of mine. Right, I'll jump in with another one of mine. And you talked specifically about partnerships, and Nina asked about those as well. And you speak from the advocates perspective, which is slightly different from our audience, and sometimes that can be helpful. Are there partnerships that are not common? And when I say common, we do recommend talking to families, talking to childcare providers, talking to organizations that are related to childcare providers. But are there some other partnerships that you have seen or have experienced as an advocate in the past or part of the legislative process in the past that are really beneficial, that our participants should think about?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being a little redundant or maybe saying something everyone already knows, I do think right now, especially that like chambers of commerce and the business community, making sure, especially if you're going to be talking taxes, making sure that you're kind of in some sort of community with them is going to be important.
Mhm.
And I say that because I know that in both Vermont and Louisiana, despite how different they are politically, the business community was a central part of like the coalition building strategy in both of those states. And so I think that if it's true in Vermont and Louisiana, then probably I can't think of too many other states that's not going to be true of. And so I think it's worth re-emphasizing that one, even though I know it's not really an uncommon, or I'm sure you've thought of it, but really, state and local, I think, is the other thing I would say there. Like in Louisiana, for instance, it's not like the state chamber was on board with this to begin with. It really started in Jefferson Parish, which is like the local chamber for Louisiana. And it was like more of a bottom up than a top down kind of thing, even from a business community perspective. And so I would think of that way, as like, if you've been going after like the state level folks, what is there going on in local communities that you can tap into that maybe is a little bit different calculus there?
That's great. Thank you. So I know we did have some questions in the mural, and I don't know, Nina, if you'd had a chance to go over there, or I can jump over there to look at the questions.
Sorry, Heather, I did not.
So, okay, I'll jump over there. I still have it open on another screen.
I can do it now.
Yeah. So, and I'm gonna kind of mix it up with, I know, Bruno, that we've talked about those, right, the funding opportunities, but if it's okay that I kind of switch over, this is a very data focused group. This is a group that does a lot of data analysis or oversees that around costs of childcare. And I see one of our questions is what data, so would you think is really helpful in documenting the need for new funding? And we have gotten some ideas around subsidy usage, providers accepting subsidy, but are there other data points? I know you talked about knowing what you need, that you would suggest is really helpful, or just a creative idea to have available?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Well, like maybe this is a little self-interested, but I do think having a fiscal map that gives you a comprehensive view of what's being funded and where that funding is coming from is definitely step one in terms of like a powerful data tool that you can use in your advocacy. Not the end all be all, but it really is a good starting place. And depending on your state, it might really be eye-opening to policymakers to see, the disparity there. Like, oh, wow, only X% of our state budget's going towards that. I had no idea. So I have seen that open up some eyes, and being able to kind of show that, the state's not going it alone, that it's only just whatever share of the program. I think that's been useful. And then another data point, or being able to say that you're maximizing federal funds using that kind of fiscal map, I think is also appealing, because even if you need to put up some of your own source revenue, if you can show legislators that they're leaving money on the table in X, Y, or Z grant program, that's often compelling as well. So those are some of my thoughts.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
I have a follow-up question, and then there's an interesting question from the mural too that I was hoping to ask. So in terms of data, I know a lot of states and territories are focused on data around access to childcare. do you feel like that specific kind of data would be helpful to look at the level of access in different communities within the state? And then be able to use that to say like, hey, we've got a need that's not being met in this area. This is a major issue for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be super candid with you. I think if you can frame that in terms of economic impact, which I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but like I think the access question really isn't necessarily that compelling to policymakers unless you can like quantify it for them. And so like the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation, like putting out these reports that say, like in Arkansas, we're losing $1.7 billion annually from a lack of access to childcare. I think being able to tie it to something like that, that's what's going to maybe make policymakers pause. I think if you just tell them the problem with access, there's too many different ways their head can go in terms of like what the solution would be. You need to kind of put some more meat on the bones for them.
That is a great point. So tie it, quantify it, tie it to potential lost revenue. And then this question that is from the Mural board that Carol put in the chat, I think is a really interesting one. So how would you make costs easier to swallow for legislators and stakeholders, et cetera, in terms of describing them, or who knows, maybe extrapolating them out over a period of time?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's like how do I put this? I think sometimes you just really need to bite the bullet on the big number. And I think that it's important to do that early and often, specifically because I've seen the situation where, you know, you advocate because you think that it's what you can get rather than what you need. So you're only going to go for 50 million when you know that you need 500 million. But then what happens next session when you get that 50 million and you're asking for another 450 million? So the relationship with policymakers can be strained more from not being upfront about what you really need, even though it will definitely give them a shell shock, right? Like I'm not trying to tell you that it's going to be an easy conversation to have, but if you think about this in like the long-term multi-session, multi-year campaigning like lens, I mean, you can't really get around the big number. So I think you really just have to share that with them. And then the way that you make it more palatable is that you have this data that I've, been mentioning is like, hey, this is what the money is, where the money's coming from, and the money that we're using. We have this cost estimate that'll show you that if we want to, cover all children by whatever age, it's going to cost this much more. Either we want to do that or we don't, and then pushing them to want to do that, because I at least as in our organization, that's kind of our ethos, is like, don't be scared of the big number because it's what we know we need. And so you're going to have to ask for it at some point. It's better to ask for it earlier. Maybe that's not a very good answer, but that's kind of my thinking or our thinking on that.
Yeah, I agree. That's super helpful. And do others have experience around this? So in terms of asking, you do your cost study, you find out, wow, it's going to cost a lot of money and be able to fund the program to the level that we need it funded. And then what? So curious about others' experience around this. I know it can be scary.
And then the continued, increases in costs, and it'd be interesting. Sometimes that can be challenging. You're already having increases that just, if you're operating off a market rate survey, prices childcare are going up significantly, right? So your rates go up naturally, and you may expand eligibility or institute some of the changes from the 2024 CCDF final rule. Might change some of your budget, and so that's always we'll always continue to improve, and that having that increase is important. So it'd be interesting to hear how everybody's handling those challenges. Oh, I know sometimes it takes a minute to type everything into the chat and not to jump to another question, but I am going to. So I'm going to ask you, Bruno, but I'd love to hear from others what you have identified as some changes you need. So one of the questions is around regulatory or statutory changes. For Bruno, have you seen where states or territories have had to make some initial regulatory changes prior to doing funding, or can it be kind of all part of the same process? And have you seen some of those?
I think it can all be part of the same process. The one thing that I'd say that I've seen kind of work in some states, including, I think this was relevant in Vermont, is that the state itself, like we can do cost models for you, but the state can also like do an interim legislative study on cost modeling, which I believe is what Vermont did prior to getting the payroll tax win. And so that often gives it more we'll work with state governments too, but like having it official in legislation like that makes it more of a formal kind of thing. And I think makes it easier to get buy-in from legislators. And so I know it's not exactly a regulatory thing, but in terms of like what happens piecemeal, I think often having that, making sure you have the cost modeling before you have the big ask, that's super important.
And I think that can tie back into exactly what you said, right? You're gonna have that big ask. If you all of a sudden change it because you've gotten more information, sounds like you said, have those relationships so you can have that continuous communication of why it might have changed, but try to get good data that illustrates it as much as is possible.
Right, exactly.
There's another question in the data area about visuals. So are there visuals that you think are particularly compelling?
Can I pass on this one? No, this is not my strong suit, the public comms portion of things. But I would say, like, if anyone is like embarking on a campaign or would like more information about those public comms stuff, I could connect you to someone on my team who can answer those kind of questions. I'm a dummy about that, so.
Might as well be honest, and it's not to say you're a dummy, but good to know what the gaps are. And it's a great question though, and we can look into that too and share some examples.
Yeah, and I'm happy to point people to, because I live in Vermont. I am familiar that their early childhood advocacy group spent several years focusing on. Well, they worked on many data points, but the one that they used to communicate the need was the population of children assumed to need childcare and the number of full-time childcare spaces that were available, and then the comparison of those children in high quality. And they did an interesting visual of the state and used color, that if there were I can't remember what the gap was, but I want to say if more than 50% of children didn't have access to childcare, it was like a big red spot, which was most of the state. And then they did the same comparison for high quality, which, as you can imagine, was a much bigger, kind of spread out a little bit more of the state. And they used, year after year, they used that same visual, and that legislation passed, and they continue to use that visual to show stability in childcare and if spaces are increasing. So it's just one idea that Vermont had many data points, but that was one that their advocacy group used a lot to demonstrate the need of childcare, to then demonstrate the need for funding. I'm gonna look to Nina to ask the next question, and I'll try to find that for everybody.
Yeah, no worries, Heather. So let's see here. Let's see what got a lot of likes. You asked the question about regulatory or statutory changes. We talked about the creative solutions. The partners that you have that can support funding requests. We talked about that. I think we've honestly covered a lot of your questions. There is a comment here about dashboards on the website. I think someone's just sharing that they've got dashboards on their website to show subsidy usage by county, how many kids are served, providers that accept subsidy, and how many families are on the wait list. That is incredible. And so if whoever shared that is still on the call, please feel free to share a link in the chat. I'm sure others would be interested in seeing that. And Bruno, if, not to put you on the spot with this, but do you have experience with states that use dashboards like that? Are they helpful for people, for advocates, or for people, for funders to look at to get a sense of how the landscape, what it looks like now, and how it changes?
Yeah, so I just put in the chat a link to the fiscal maps that we've done. To our website, CFP's website, our state and local fiscal maps. And basically, these are all dashboards. They're all in like Power BI. And yeah, the interactivity and the ability for analysts, policymakers, etc., to go in there and like manipulate the data. Yeah, we found that to be super helpful, a super useful tool for advocates. So that's why we put them in that format, largely speaking.
That's great, thanks. And then Carol put a question in the chat. Have you heard of states doing an economic impact study to show the impact that childcare has?
Yeah, so Louisiana did that in order to kind of one of the tools they use to win their dedicated funding. The Louisiana Policy Institute for Children worked with maybe the Chamber of Commerce to do that. If I can find it, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Lots of good resources. Thank you. And then Heather included the resource from Vermont, the visual from Vermont.
Right. I posted the most recent visual, but if you go to their website, you can see the years. They're using the same report every year, though. Same year report, different data. Does anybody have any other questions? Actually, I had some questions, but we've like moved on from them. So I think you addressed this, Bruno, but around pros and cons of using a current funding source versus a brand new funding source. But is there anything you could build on that? I know, and I imagine that's political climate, but sometimes you may not be as familiar with what works or what doesn't. Are there some questions you use when you're working with states around what's the pro or con of using an existing source versus trying to pursue a new source of funding?
So I'd say that question mostly comes to just being opportunistic, to be honest with you, just doing catch as catch can in terms of the source, which isn't to say like we'll obviously go through the pros and cons of any revenue source in terms of like, is it going to be adequate to the need? Where's the revenue going to come from? So how regressive is it? Does it come mainly from the poor who have less of an ability to pay, or does it come from the wealthy who have more of an ability to pay? Those kind of things will definitely analyze whether or not it's an old or new source. But in terms of like which one to land on, we're kind of agnostic about that because, like I said, it's a big enough need and like enough of a gap between where we're at and where we need to be, that it really needs to be like don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, I think is kind of our ethos on that. And so there's just going to be some states where that new revenue source is going to be what's palatable to your policymakers. And even if it's not the ideal revenue source, I think it's kind of like almost like improv. You do a yes and kind of thing, honestly, is kind of how I think about it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to think about it. The yes and, because I sometimes default, having been in early childhood a very long time, to the but you don't know, instead of thinking in the yes and you have this great opportunity and look what you can do, kind of thing.
And in particular, thinking about it in the sense, or we hope, we like to think at least that, it kind of helps build your base, like small wins, build to bigger wins. So like kind of getting the small win to get the proof of concept, to get the base of advocates, to get the participants that now know that the program is useful and like it builds on itself in a couple of different ways. So I just thought that was worth pointing out.
Yeah. And I think Louisiana, your example from Louisiana was a great point. They got the fund, but it was 2 years, it wasn't funded at all. And then it was funded, but a very small amount before it's now built over, I think 7 years, or a long time.
Yep.
And I think it illustrates what we've talked about before, which is we know that this number that you get when you're doing a cost study can be a big number and a scary number. But if you know what you need and you've got a plan in place, then when the opportunity presents itself, you're ready to move.
Mhm.
Very well put. I think that's a great way to summarize everything I've said in one sentence, I think.
All right, so I am going to just share my thank you screen and remind everybody that we do have a question or two of evaluation when you leave the meeting. It will pop up for you. Really helpful for you to complete that. Let us know. You can email me directly. I think everybody here probably has my email. If you have any ideas for topics, we have a November session is going to be on cost modeling for special populations such as children with disabilities, non-traditional care. And December session is going to be on engaging with your tribes. So we're looking forward to both of those sessions.
And Heather, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but there's a question about where to get a copy of the recording. Can you answer that?
Yeah, so we did record this session. It will take us a little while to process it, edit it, get it ready. Probably it usually takes a couple of weeks. It will likely be posted on the Child Care Technical Assistance Network webpage. And once it is, I will send, as I send the notes out from the meetings, I will also send where the recording is for this session, and we'll share it with the regional offices, so you can also ask your Office of Child Care Regional Office for a copy of the recording. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Bruno, so much for sharing all of your knowledge. This has been really super helpful. And I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks for letting me come. Thanks.
Thank you.